Cooperation and multilateralism. China lays out its foreign policy vision. We will take a look on how that can be achieved. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. China is currently holding its biggest week in politics, the two sessions, meetings that will define the way forward for the country. On the sidelines of those meetings, the State Councilor and Foreign Minister Wang held his annual press conference and highlighted China's priorities on foreign policy. CGTN's Zheng Yibing reports from Beijing.
Wang began body commitment to the global fight against COVID-19.
China will continue to cooperate with other countries in solidarity and work tirelessly towards humanity's final victory against this pandemic.
He added, China would donate vaccines to global peacekeepers and Olympic athletes.
China opposes vaccine nationalism and rejects any vaccine divide or any attempt to politicize vaccine cooperation.
Wang stressed the UN's role in the international system, as well as the multilateralism embedded in its charter.
True multilateralism means observing the purposes and principles of the UN Charter, upholding the UN-centered international system, and making international relations more democratic.
This year marks the 20th anniversary of China's accession to the World Trade Organization. The Chinese foreign minister said all countries and regions should stay committed to the principle of win-win cooperation and find solutions together.
The answer is not to retreat into protectionism, isolation, or decoupling, but to work together to make globalization more open, inclusive, balanced, and beneficial for all.
In terms of China's massive international development project, the Belt and Road Initiative, Wang said China would continue to promote cooperation with all players so the initiative can be the robust engine for the post-pandemic global economic recovery. He praised ties with Russia, saying they were standing together to maintain world peace and stability. Japan is due to host the Summer Olympics later this year, and China the Winter Games next February. He said the two countries would work together to ensure their success. And on the United States, Wang stressed the importance of dialogue.
What matters most is to manage the differences and disagreements effectively through candid communication to prevent strategic miscalculation and avoid conflict and confrontation.
China says it will join hands with other countries to address global challenges like global economic recovery, infectious diseases, and climate change. China also says it will continue to pursue the policy of opening up and cooperation and promote the building of the new type of international relations with a shared future for mankind. Zheng Yibing, CGTN, Beijing.
We have a lot to discuss. Let's bring in our experts from New York via Skype. Robert Hormats is the Managing Director for Tiedemann Advisors and former U.S. Under-Secretary of State. Jorge Heine is a research professor at Boston University and former Chilean ambassador to China. He joins us from Boston. From Villanova, Pennsylvania via Skype, Jacques DeLisle is the director for the Center for East Asian Studies at the University of Pennsylvania. And Einar Tangen is a current affairs commentator. He joins us from Beijing. Thanks, everyone, for being with us. Einar Tangen, let me start with you. Foreign Minister Wang there talking in very broad strokes about China's foreign policy goals. What did you make of it? What was the main thrust of his message to the world?
Well, it was a very stark contrast to Anthony Blinken's message last 2 weeks ago, in which he outlined, a kind of hostile relationship between U.S. and China. Wang Yi stressed all of the positives, how it can be done, but he also laid down some red lines. China is not interested in interference in Taiwan, Hong Kong, Tibet, or Xinjiang. So the doors have been opened, but the red lines have been drawn.
So was that a sort of warning to the rest of the world, rest of the Western world, I should say, not to interfere?
Well, yeah, well, specifically to the United States and to any allied countries who believe that they can pressure China into changing its governance system. I mean, this is very clear. The One China policy is a red line. Taiwan is part of that. And if you start looking at 40 years of what China perceives as a success, not only in terms of economics, but as the way they see human rights, they're not going to be backing down, but they make it clear that their approach internationally is multilateral. They want to have a very positive and upbeat relationship, and they desperately want to have a reset with the U.S. based on the issues that they can agree on as opposed to the ones they cannot.
Jacques DeLisle, the minister also emphasized China's commitment to multilateralism. After 4 years of Donald Trump's America First policy, do you think this message from the Chinese State Councilor and Foreign Minister will resonate with the new administration in Washington?
I think it will. I think it does two things. As what we just heard in the prior discussion, it is partly China touting its commitment to multilateralism and taking advantage, really, of the ground that China has gained in the last 4 years when the United States has been absent and indeed has been undermining a lot of those institutions and a lot of multilateralism. So the commitment to multilateralism echoes a lot of what the Biden administration has said it wants to do, but there is, again, this sense that the U.S. has some repair work to do in terms of showing its commitment to those kinds of institutions and processes.
So, Jacques, would it be fair to say then, as far as multilateralism is concerned, the Biden administration is going to be very selective in what it does in its cooperation with China?
I think there is a sort of walking on two legs. One of them perhaps kicking the other not so much. So what I think we're going to see is an emphasis on those areas from the Biden administration where they think cooperation with China is possible. Climate change gets a lot of attention in that regard. Pandemic diseases, COVID-19, gets some attention. Economic recovery, perhaps. So that is the cooperative side in approaching China, both bilaterally and in multilateral contexts. But it coexists with a much tougher line. We're not going to see a return in the Biden administration to a full pre-Trump status quo. There is a much tougher attitude toward China, a much more extensive list of criticisms, and a suspicion that there's a lot of areas of genuine conflicts of interest.
Robert Hormats, in a recent podcast, you mentioned you were engaging with Foreign Minister Wang Yi in a webinar, at which time the Chinese Foreign Minister emphasized that China wants to increase its cooperation with the United States. Tell us more about that.
Well, yes, it was a very interesting conversation or webinar, and it was quite clear that China wants to develop closer ties with the U.S. It wants to put the tone of the discourse, of the narrative during the Trump administration behind it, and the United States to take a more forthcoming view toward cooperation with China. On the other hand, China is now a country that feels itself to be in a much stronger position. It used the last 4 years to strengthen its role as a major multilateral player in the UN, in Davos, and various other groups in the environment. And the U.S. now has to try to figure out how to work with China multilaterally, but also recognize that there is in American politics today a higher level of skepticism, and some would say higher level of negative feeling among some in both parties toward China, so that the domestic politics toward China in the United States are not, as the previous speaker indicated, the same as they were during the Obama administration. So the U.S. has to figure out how to work with China multilaterally, but also deal with much stronger domestic and bipartisan feeling that it needs to take a tougher line on a whole range of issues, and Biden has said this during his campaign.
So, Robert, China may want to engage more with the United States, may want to discuss cooperation with the United States, but is the United States' position that they will adopt a twin-track policy? One of those tracks is going to be a very hostile attitude towards China. The other is going to be, we will cooperate with you in areas that are of common interest, things like climate change or fighting the pandemic or international terrorism, things like that.
I wouldn't necessarily use the word hostile, but I would say a very assertive perspective on a substantial number of issues. At the same time, working as cooperatively as it can with these multilateral issues like climate change, like medical cooperation dealing with the pandemic. There are going to be a lot of global financial issues following up the fact that so many countries have accumulated so much debt during the pandemic. The US and China, after all, did work together very closely in 2008 during the financial crisis and can do that again if there's need be. So it is a two-track policy. One is to be much more assertive on areas where the United States has very strong views, and China, in turn, will be very assertive where it has strong views. And Wang Yi has made this point, and other senior Chinese have made this point, that China intends to be assertive and it's not going to get pushed around by the United States, and it feels that it's in a stronger position multilaterally. The United States has to work back what has gone on in the last 4 years to try to strengthen its multilateral role, and it has to begin to develop, and is on the way to doing it, closer ties with allies and friends that it had, to a degree, alienated during the last 4 years, and some of that will be trying to cooperate with countries and put some pressure on China on intellectual property and other issues. But the United States has to earn its way back as a trusted partner with friends and allies over the next several months in order to have a common position on very important international, financial, and other issues.
Ambassador Jorge Heine, looking at China's regional involvement around the world, we heard the foreign minister there talk about China's involvement in Latin America, talked about the fight against COVID and the supply of vaccines to countries all around the world, including those countries in Latin America. How significant has this Chinese support been for the countries in this part of the world, in the Western Hemisphere?
Well, in the Western Hemisphere, it's been quite significant. In terms of what was known as mask diplomacy, that is providing equipment, PPE, masks, and so on. I was looking at some numbers. Last year, China provided $215 million in cooperation to countries in Latin America. Latin America has been very badly hit by the pandemic. With 8% of the world's population, it has about 25% of the world's deaths. So, you know, it's pretty bad. And I would say that on that front, China has really come through. We're seeing that now also with the vaccines. Chile, as an example, is one of the countries that has vaccinated the most people, not just in Latin America, but also worldwide. And one reason it has been able to do so is because it has been able to rely on Chinese vaccines, Sinovac from Sinopharm, that it has been deploying. So I would say that on the question of dealing with the pandemic, China is one country that has really come through for the region. Much remains to be done. The situation is quite dire in many ways, but we hope to see more of that.
Ambassador Heine, you tweeted recently, you said in a tweet, when AMLO, that was a reference to the Mexican president, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, you said when AMLO thanks Russia, India, and China for their vaccines to fight COVID-19, you realize something is going on. So tell us more about that. What do you think is going on?
Yes, well, I think it's quite remarkable. AMLO, as you know, the president of Mexico, has been a particularly pro-Trump president. The only visit he did abroad in his years he's been in office was to Washington. He kept very good relations with Mr. Trump. He has not visited Latin America, as a matter of fact. So he was seen as someone very close to the United States. Yet, at the moment when he needed vaccines, they didn't come from up north. And he said, well, I am relying on Russia, China, and India to come through for the vaccines that I need. And I think this points to a broader issue, which has to do with the role of what has been called extra-regional powers in Latin America, like those that President Manuel López Obrador mentioned. And that is the following. Latin America has diversified its international links in the course of the past 20 years very much. It used to be only dealing with the US and with Western European nations. Now it is engaged all around the world. Yet in the past couple of years, countries in the region have been subjected to all sorts of pressures, including some that want to revive the Monroe Doctrine, trying to limit those links with the rest of the world. And what I was trying to say is that this pandemic has shown that Latin America needs more links with the rest of the world, not fewer. And that has come through with the case of those countries that are providing the vaccines right now. They're not coming from Europe. They're not coming from North America. They're coming from Asia.
Robert Hormats, what are your thoughts on that kind of vaccine diplomacy?
Well, I couldn't really hear what was said. It didn't come through. So,
well, I'll just summarize it for you. What Ambassador Heine was telling us was that during this COVID-19 pandemic, the country that came through to Latin American countries as far as vaccines were concerned was China. It was not the United States. It was not Western Europe. China actually supplied most of the vaccines.
Well, you know, I think the U.S. is developing the production capability to meet a rising number of domestic needs and scale out its utilization of the three approved vaccines so far. And I think we, over a period of time, will probably see the export of more of those vaccines. We're still in a relatively early stage just in meeting the internal demands of Americans. So I wouldn't make any judgments at this point. I think we have to see over a period of time how this works out. I think President Biden said that Americans will have the chance, those who want it, to be vaccinated by May. If that's the case, I think you'll see, and there is spare vaccine around because production capabilities are rising substantially for the three major vaccines that are now approved. Then I think you'll see more of these vaccines going to other countries, and so I wouldn't completely close the book on this as being a factor in the medium term.
Einar Tangen, I want to move on to another issue right now, and that is foreign media coverage of China. That was something that was addressed by the foreign minister during that news conference. He called on journalists, foreign journalists who work in China, in his words, not to apply any filters to their coverage. How sensitive an issue is this for China?
Well, it's very sensitive. I mean, I remember talking to a veteran journalist who had been here for 20 years, and she said that when she came, she was credentialed by the vice minister from MOFCOM. And he basically said, listen, I'm not going to necessarily agree with everything you say, but I just want you to be fair. 20 years later, as she was leaving China, I asked her, were you fair? And she said, well, it wasn't up to me. The editors didn't like the pieces, the positive pieces I did. Mm-hmm. And this is what you're seeing, whether it's the reporters or the editors. Only bad news sells. And you know what you can see in this last 4 years, the approval ratings or the attitude towards China has plummeted. It's now near 80% negative, seeing China as a threat. And that's a reflection not only of the leadership, but of the willingness of the international press to buy in and to reinforce that on a daily drumbeat basis. For instance, you know, we've just heard all of this stuff about how, you know, it's fine for the U.S. to be this me first policy when it comes to COVID, talking about, you know, taking the new moral leadership abroad. You know, I think freshly burned in all of our minds is what happened at the Capitol, what happened you know, with Black Lives Matter, this young man being kneeled on and his neck until he died. What happened in Texas? It's hard to take the moral leadership abroad when it doesn't seem to be present at home. So where is the press on this? Where's the moral outrage? Where's the questioning of the system? Yet in China, as it reacts to constant attacks from a trade and political and quote human rights unquote basis, the press buys into it wholesale. Where is the evidence that they talk to? If somebody who's Chinese steals something from anybody, it's attributed to the state. I mean, it's not the same standard when the U.S. does it on a routine basis, or when, you know, you have German banks who are involved. Why is there this double standard? And that, I think, is what he's getting at. There seems to be this filter, and it is not journalistic integrity. It's simply biased yellow journalism.
Jacques DeLisle, China has always emphasized its policy of non-interference in the internal affairs of other countries, and we heard that again from Foreign Minister Wang. He criticized the United States for interfering or meddling in China's domestic affairs. How do you see this play out between the two countries?
Well, it's been a long-term issue. It's been a factor really ever since the U.S. and China reestablished diplomatic relations more than a generation ago now. The U.S. has, as part of its foreign policy, certain views on human rights and democracy promotion, and it's certainly sometimes do as I say, not as I do. But there is that agenda. China sees that as mucking around inside its internal affairs. The U.S. has a different view in terms of a proper role in promoting human rights and democracy around the world, and that friction is just, I think, baked in. We're seeing a return to a broader spectrum, not just religious rights, but human rights more generally in the Biden administration. But I think there's a certain amount of realism about dealing with countries that you criticize. And I think China has, at some level, acclimated itself to the idea that the U.S. is going to be critical on this. Where we see the real frictions coming are where the charges get into more than just what we're familiar with, but the issues of labeling what's going on in Xinjiang as genocide, which is a very controversial label, and where you see things going on that are especially visible internationally. So Hong Kong is quite visible to the outside world, in part because some of the journalists who used to cover the mainland are now out in Hong Kong for visa reasons, and because of Taiwan, which is this neuralgic issue of Chinese integrity and sovereignty, and it would be a real change in the de facto status quo if Taiwan were to be squeezed. So I think some of this is baked in as background, but the real flashpoints are ones where China sees the issues as especially sensitive rather than just a general critique of human rights behavior or political system.
Although, as we just heard, Jacques, China considers these domestic issues. It pursues a policy of a one China.
Right. I mean, I think, and the U.S. has its one China policy, and China has its one China principle. So there are a couple things going on here. One, I think, is a general friction about commenting on another state's internal behavior, and the U.S. does that more than many countries do, to the frustration of China and other countries. And then there is this question about particular policy areas that are productive of friction, where there was a question about how to define them. And China's position has been that a range of things that China takes offense at U.S. behavior toward is interfering in China's internal affairs. The U.S. just sees those as general principles applicable everywhere. We're not going to get rid of that. The question is how to keep these things from becoming real flashpoints and points of conflict. And I think when we get into those, it's often we're out of the realm of the kind of rhetorical critiques that people do or don't take offense at, and into things that can become more kinetic. That's what people worry about with Taiwan. And I think much as the labeling of internal affairs versus protecting an existing democratic system, which is where the basic disagreement falls. Where we get into, I think, real concerns about it spilling over is where the U.S. calls on China to cease the pressure on Taiwan, and China calls on the U.S. to stay the heck out.
Ambassador Jorge Heine, China's signature foreign development outreach, if I could put it that way, is its Belt and Road Initiative, which provides money, expertise, and in some cases labor to countries for infrastructure projects, mainly in developing countries. It's also trying to reestablish trade routes around the world. The United States is very critical of that policy. The United States says the initiative is what it calls debt trap diplomacy. We know that China is deeply involved in building infrastructure in Latin America. How does the region see this?
Well, the region at first was a bit surprised. As you know, the New Silk Road, which is what the BRI is all about, the old Silk Road didn't reach South America. So there was an element of surprise there. But obviously, Latin America needs better and more infrastructure. We have a big deficit there. We are exporting nations. We need better ports, better bridges, more railways, more connectivity. In that sense, the BRI in Latin America is welcome. Obviously, projects have to be evaluated each in its own terms, whether they are feasible, whether they are viable. But in overall terms, I would say that the perspective on more infrastructure projects financed by Chinese banks or not, built by Chinese companies or not, is something that is very much on the agenda. Panama has been very keen to move on that. Brazil has very keen to move on that. In Chile, my own country, a Chinese company recently won a bid for a stretch of the North-South Highway. So there's a lot of movement in that direction.
Robert Hormats, that podcast that we were talking about earlier, you also said that you did not think that Biden would take a softer approach to China, but will in fact take a harder line. I mean, if we look at what's going on right now, he's retained many of the hardline policies that President Trump imposed on China. The tariffs remain in place. Question is, what is the end goal for the United States?
Well, I said that he would probably take a softer line than Trump, but probably a harder line than Obama or under the Obama administration. And I think what the American policy is, if I can boil it down, it is get closer to your allies, find out how the U.S. and its key allies can work together vis-a-vis their issues that they have, common issues that they have with regard to China. The U.S. probably won't rejoin the reordered TPP, but can work with countries in the TPP instead of pulling away from them. Probably is going to work more closely with the Quad, which is Japan, Australia, India, and the United States. But I think the tone vis-a-vis China there may be a lot of assertiveness, and certainly there'll be more assertiveness than during the Obama administration.
Right.
But the tone will not be as harsh as during the Trump administration. And people like Tony Blinken or Jake Sullivan and others are going to look for some areas. And they know China pretty well, these two guys. I've worked with them closely over the years. They're going to look for some areas where they can work with China. So I think there'll be assertiveness on areas that the United States considers important to its interest. China may push back and almost certainly will. But I do think that the administration will try working with other countries, friends and allies, to try to develop some kind of relationship with China that aims to get at some of the issues like intellectual property and trade secrets and cooperation on finance and cooperation on the climate issue and global financial issues. So I think it'll really be a combination of the two. It'll be a balancing act, assertive where you feel you have to be, and cooperative where you think you can get things done either bilaterally or in a multilateral or a regional way. So it's going to be it won't be a one size fits all. It'll be much more complicated than that. But I do think they want a much better tone than during the last 4 years. And I do think they want to try to at least find some areas where progress can be made. They know these Chinese leaders pretty well. Biden knows President Xi quite well from his conversations over the years. So they're going to try to find areas where there is cooperation, but they're going to be assertive where they have strong domestic views and pressures here.
Okay, and that's where we have to leave it. We have run out of time. That's it for this edition of The Heat. Thanks to all of you for being with us. I'm Arnold Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching.